Alright YouTube, we got a very ambitious project today. I'm going to tackle my Twig stoves and try to do a quick review on the 4 different types that I own and have some experience using, and hopefully by the end of this you'll have a better idea on what Twig stove might be a good fit for you. And let's get right into it. So starting left to right, represented here is the one on the left is a Chinese knockoff of the Emberlit. It's actually called the Rover Camel. It's made out of titanium, including the case. It weighs in at 7.7 ounces, and it ran me 25 bucks on eBay. Now, if you actually get the titanium Emberlit, you're going to be spending $77 or somewhere in that area. Like I say, it weighs in at 7.7 ounces. So the next one over you'll see is the Firebox Nano Titanium. I did a full video review on that stove. You can look it up on my channel if you want more information. But that was $80 and weighs in, the way I carry it, it weighs in at 4.7 ounces. The next stove up is a no-name Chinese stainless steel gasifier stove. 20 bucks on eBay, and it weighs in at a pound, 16 ounces on the money. And the last one on the right you're going to see is my Bush Buddy stainless steel stove. It was $100 and it weighs in at 6.2 ounces. So now we're going to go into each stove and kind of give you a run through on my feelings about those stoves. Okay, first up is the Emberlit clone. So this is the titanium Rover Camel. This is how it comes packaged when you get it. It comes in this nylon carry case with a Velcro closure. Yeah, not bad. Gets the job done. So you're definitely going to want to use that because this stove gets very yucky. And you don't want to just have that free ranging around inside your backpack because it'll gum up everything else. But anyway, putting it together is a little fiddly, and you're definitely going to get your hands a little grimy in the process, but I'll run you through how it works. Like that. This is the front, so this is going to go, well actually I'll put that on last. Like that. And you put this tray in the bottom, kind of fits in these slots here. Put your front on. Like I said, a little bit fiddly. Best way to describe it, but not a deal breaker, not terribly obnoxious. Just takes a minute to put together. I don't mind. And there she is. Now, the beauty of the stove, well, one of the benefits of it is that you could take an alcohol stove, pop it in there, light it up. Now, I don't know if the spacing is correct on that. Probably a little bit too much room between where your alcohol stove sets and where your pot's going to be. Not an ideal spacing, but that will work in there. And it also acts as a nice windscreen, so you save a little bit of weight not having to bring a windscreen. But like I said, the spacing's off. It will work though. See if I can demonstrate that real quick. Let me get my lighter. Okay, here's some alcohol. This stove was actually donated to me by Zelf. He makes them. He made this stove by hand. Each one is individually handcrafted. And there it is. I don't know if you could see that or not, but ooh, yeah, that's working. So first of all, I want to thank Zelf for sending me that stove. I was posting on Bushcraft USA about how I have an upcoming long distance through hike, and he read the post. We were talking about gear and stoves, and out of the goodness of his heart, man, he just connected me with a whole bunch of equipment, including that alcohol stove. He owns a stove company. It's called zelfstoves.com, so free plug for him there. But yeah, he hooked me up with a whole bunch of gear, and I'm super appreciative for that. But anyway, back to the Rover Camel. You can see that it works. I definitely have flame protruding up beyond the crossbars. Probably doesn't show up well in the video, but that's a winner, right? That's gonna work. And if you had concerns that the flame height wasn't correct, you could just bring a little something to put underneath there to raise the height of it. But there you go. There's the alcohol stove Emberlit combination. Okay, so the reason you might want to bring an alcohol stove like Zelf's, and this thing's beautiful, by the way. It's got some kind of batting on the inside of it, so it captures the alcohol once you pour it in there. So if you tip it over, it won't spill out. So great job, Zelf. But the reason you might want to bring an alcohol stove like this companion burner on a backpacking trip is sometimes you get some really inclement weather that are going to make operating this stove impracticable. Or, like you wake up in the morning, you don't want to go through the whole process of collecting tinder and all that stuff and building a fire. You get something like a canister stove or an alcohol stove or an Esbit tablet. Just whammo, instant coffee and oatmeal. So sometimes you just don't want to be bothered. But sometimes you do want to be bothered. And that's kind of the whole point of these Twig stoves, for me anyway, when I'm backpacking, is it's just super enjoyable to have a fire. So we got the Esbit all loaded up, and this is a top-down burn, so the concept here is that you start the fire on the top, the stove's already loaded, and there's enough fuel in there to boil 2 cups of water or whatever you're doing, so you don't have to be refueling it while you're operating the stove. So right now, early September in Florida, it's probably the most challenging fire building conditions imaginable. It poured all night last night, so don't judge me. But yeah, if you're from out of state, you're thinking about coming to Florida, like June, July, August, September, man, it's brutal. You want to come down for Christmas, that's really ideal. But anyway, of all my twig burning stoves, I would have to say that this Emberlit is probably the easiest to operate. Huge plus for this stove. And I attribute that to the fact that it has such a large burn chamber for the the tiny size of the stove. And it packs down flat as a pancake, very packable. But it has a very large burn chamber, and it also has a lot of ventilation. So the combination of a lot of fuel with a lot of oxygen, it burns hotter. It's easier to keep going. You can get a bed of coals in there because of the size of it that will that make it easy to keep running in wet conditions, or conditions that are less than ideal. You can see, look at the water boiling on the top of that twig. That's how much water is inside of this wood. It's actually boiling out. Anyway, some of the downsides to this stove are that I think it's a little more of a fire hazard than my other stoves, because it'll squirt fire out of, like, some of these holes sometimes around the sides. It's not a deal breaker for me. So now that I got my fire established, I'll take my crossbars, kind of plug them in. Nice thing about those crossbars is it'll accommodate any size pot, large, small. Has a huge surface area there that supports everything. So, you know, if you got a 750 milliliter cup, 500 milliliter cup, it'll support that. If you got a giant, you know, 2-liter pot, good to go. It'll take it all. But puts out a really good sized flame, puts out a lot of heat. Just a great stove. I'm telling you, I'm glad I got it, and you won't regret buying it, especially if you get the knockoff for whatever it is, 25 bucks. But another downside is that when I use this stove out in the field, typically, and I didn't do it today, I should have, but like this is a Stouffer's lasagna pan, and I just cut out a section, doubled it over, and I should have put that underneath. Maybe I'll just lift it up and squeeze it under there, because this stove will definitely scorch. It'll scorch wood on the bottom, or whatever's underneath it, it'll scorch it. It's got all those ventilations on the bottom, it'll leak embers out. And it's got this huge wide feed area in the front, so you can just shove your twigs right in there. Extremely easy to feed, extremely easy to get going, easy to keep going. So I don't know, it's got a lot of pluses for it. Lightweight. The negatives, like I said, fiddly to put together, a little dirty to put together. Now you can see it right here where it's leaking out the side a little bit. Leaks fire out the side. Sometimes a little ember will pop out over there. But anyway, love this stove. It's a winner, and I recommend it. You can see it's putting out a flame, probably a ½ a foot, 8 inches over the top of the stove right now, and it'll keep burning like that for you know, as long as I feed it. And I'm trying to think anything else about this stove. Oh yeah, the titanium plate on the bottom, very thin grade titanium, and that does warp from the heat. Not a deal breaker, because if it gets bad enough, you just bend it back. I mean, you just have to be accepting of the fact that it warps a little bit. I haven't had warping problems with the rest of the stove. I think it's actually less perforated than the bottom plate, so that keeps it straighter. I don't know. Flame probably a foot over the top of the stove right now. So yeah, great stove, great Twig stove. Okay, moving on. That thing just cooks. It does burn through, it burns through the fuel a little faster because of the intensity of the fire. But like I say, this is probably my hottest, fastest cooking stove, easiest to keep running. And listen, I'm not doing a I'm not doing a burn test, like a boil test, on any of these Twig stoves. In my experience of the ones that I own, this one's the quickest. But like if it's like a speed competition for you to boil water, and you brought a Twig stove, you're doing it wrong. Right? So just get yourself a canister stove or a white gas stove or something, and you're off to the races. For me, I mean, part of the ambiance of these Twig stoves is the process, really. The process of lighting the fire and having the fire there. You know, I don't mind that it takes a little longer. And another nice feature about this stove, you just kind of saw it there, is that because of the size of the stove, I could feed very large pieces of wood. Well, not very large, but larger pieces of wood into this thing. I mean, I'm talking larger than thumb size. And that gives it kind of an edge as far as duration of burn. So you could feed it some larger wood and walk away from it for a while. Come back, it'll still be going. So that is the Emberlit titanium stove. Okay, next up we have the Firebox Nano titanium. I did a full review on just this stove. Check it out. But love it. Great stove. This is how I carry it. It's inside a little Ziploc, I guess it's a hefty. I don't want to get sued. It's a little sandwich bag. And then inside that I got the cloth carry case that came with it. And then here's the stove. Like I said, 4.7 ounces total weight. It's phenomenal, right? So, sets up, boom. Just that easy. I'm set up. So, wicked simple. There's no parts to lose, and it sets up in seconds. So that's all part of why I love it, and the weight. So this stove makes a lot of sense as a backpacking stove. If you're going on a trip and you want to include a Twig stove, well, here's a good question. Why would you even want to bring a Twig stove on a backpacking trip, right? Why not just build a fire? So, there's a lot of times when you're on a backpacking trip that you are in an area that you can't build a fire. Or maybe you want the ambiance of a fire, but you don't want to go through the process of collecting, you know, hours worth of firewood, which is quite a chore, especially if you didn't bring a lot of tools. So like for me, when I'm backpacking long distance, I hardly bring any tools, or I try not to bring as many tools. So a Twig stove like this, you could feed this stove with fuel that you could break with just your hands. You don't need any tools at all. So, and you could use this stove in places where you wouldn't be able to have a fire. So those are the two biggest reasons. But anyway, let me load this thing up and we'll get it going and talk about it some more. All right, so we got the Firebox Nano loaded up. Let's see if we can get it going. So the attributes of this stove that we talked about that make it so appealing are that it's extremely compact and lightweight. It is the smallest and lightest backpacking Twig stove that I own. And I mean by a long shot. It's 2 to 3 times lighter than a lot of these other options. So, if you're into Twig stoves and you're also into long distance hiking and backpacking, this stove makes a lot of sense. This might be your huckleberry. So those are the positive attributes about it. The downsides to the Firebox Nano Titanium. I would have to say the number one downside to this stove is that the burn chamber is so small, and that's attributed to the fact that the whole stove is small. So that translates to this stove being much fussier to get going and keep going, especially in harder conditions to build a fire, because you can't get the coal base in this stove like you can in some of the larger stoves, and it's that base of coals that enables you to keep the heat going inside this burn chamber, and that's what enables the fire to continue. And another downside would be that because the burn chamber is so small, obviously you can't fit a lot of wood in there, so you have to feed it a lot more. So you have to constantly you have to be paying attention to this stove. And I mean, you know, I guess some people would consider that a negative. For somebody else, it might be a positive that, you know, it's a very engaging process. So you are actively involved in the process of cooking your food, or you're boiling your water, or whatever you're doing. It's all hands on deck. Now, it also has large vent holes. I can't show it to you right now because the stove is on fire, but it has large vent holes in the bottom of the stove. So best practice would be to use a piece of foil or something underneath it. In reality, I very rarely bring a ground sheet for this stove because the whole point of it is to be as light as possible. So I'll just put it on the ground in an area where I don't have a concern about the earth getting scorched. But you can see it does its job, and it does it well, man. I mean, that's why it's one of my go-tos. It's just a great little stove. What else? It is it's pretty stable. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not a stable stove, but of all the stoves that you're going to see today, this is probably the least stable of them all. I'm not saying it's not stable, but you can see how it sits up a little bit higher due to the legs, and as a result of that, you kind of got to watch what you're doing around it. You don't want to, you know, make sure you don't kick it over or anything. What else? Once you get a pot on there and you're actually cooking, the space here to feed your twigs into can be a little restrictive, especially if you have a large diameter pot, because now you got to kind of work underneath the pot and fit it in between this. I would say it's about a 1/2 to 3/4 inch slot here to kind of push your sticks into the stove without burning your hand. So that's a little bit of a challenge sometimes. If you got like a 750 pot, or you know, even up to 1,000 milliliter pot, that's not going to be an issue for you. You're going to be able to just pop them right in. And of course, you have these side feed areas here, so you can always put your sticks in there. I guess I tend to use the top more. I don't know, if I'm being truthful to myself. I like to top feed it. All right, so there you go. Firebox Nano Titanium. I guess I could also add that because the burn chamber is smaller, it kind of reduces the size of the fuel that you could put in there, so you're going to be using smaller sticks. And it does not do well with larger size fuel. As soon as you start trying to put like pinky size or thumb size wood into the stove, you're going to start choking it out, and that's as a result of the fact that the burn chamber is so much smaller. You just don't have, I mean, listen, this is here in Florida, right, where everything's damp. I mean, if you're out in Arizona, you could probably, you could burn anything in this thing out there. Right? It's all super dry wood, but here, the burn chamber is not large enough to get a sufficient bed of coals and heat going to get that larger wood going. So you're going to be relegated to smaller twigs. Not that that's a problem, it's just something to be aware of. So like I said, you are tuned into this stove. When you're using it, you're paying attention to it, because it requires nurturing. All right, I think that's it. I got everything. Great stove though, love it. And then, you know, you can kind of grab it by the legs and move it around a little bit if you have to, because they're removed from the stove. So that's a nice feature, being able to readjust things while the stove's running. I think that's everything. I keep saying that's it, and I keep coming back with something else. I think that's it this time. All right, next up we got the Chinese gasifier stove, and here's how it comes from the factory when you get it. The setup process, pretty straightforward. Well, I guess there's a little learning curve. You can see that burn tray on the bottom. You got to make sure that you extend that down. Slowly protruding it out of the base. Top goes on, right? It inverts when you're storing it. Goes on like that. So, this stove weighs 1 pound. You might be asking yourself, Will, why the heck did you why did you buy that $20 1 pound stainless steel stove? Because I had my eye on the Bush Buddy. This is a gasifier stove, and so is the Bush Buddy. So I was deliberating buying the Bush Buddy. The Bush Buddy's expensive, so I said, hey, you know what? Let me spend 20 bucks and try a cheap Chinese gasifier stove out, and see if I like it. And if I like it, then I'll make the plunge. And man, I like it. I mean, well, we'll go through it. Let me load this thing up, and I'll bring you back, and we'll go through all the features. All right, I got it all loaded up. Before I light it, I'll just show you the bottom of the stove. You could see that some of those diamond-shaped air vents on the bottom are kind of fire rotted out, and honestly, I think that's kind of my fault. And let me light it and I'll kind of get into it. So, the nice thing about this stove is it has just a huge burn chamber. You see, it'll be real easy to light as a result of that, because you just have that wide open top space there. But anyway, with the bottom, what happened there was, like I say, I bought this as kind of a test run for my Bush Buddy. So this is kind of my beater stove, and I just leave this thing out here. And there's been a couple times where I got it, you know, red hot cooking on it. And then before I left, I just splashed it with water. I've run this thing for hours, literally hours and hours. So, you know, I've really abused this stove. So I think when you do stuff like that, it changes the temper of the steel. It causes it to crack, which is, I think, what happened on the bottom there. When I splashed that cold water on there, I think it just cracked between those two diamonds. And then when you leave it out in the weather, you know, that ash paste, like when you have ashes and then it rains, ash is extremely acidic, and then when it mixes with water, it does like really crazy stuff. Even a stainless steel, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna rust and rot it out. So that's all definitely my fault. So don't judge the stove for that. But that's a good lesson, you know, for stove care. Definitely don't to cool it off. You never want to hit it with hot water. I mean, cold water. Live and learn. But that was kind of the point of getting the stove, was to try it out. So anyway, what do I like and not like about this stove? Hang on, let me get some more twigs. Okay, I don't like the weight of it. Weighing it at 1 pound, you know, definitely excessive for backpacking. This is not it's not something I would take out on the trail. What would I use it for? Car camping. If you have like an off-grid cabin, this would be a good option for cooking there. Because like I'll use my property as an example. I'm on 10 acres, and I like to come out here and make a fire and cook coffee every weekend morning. It's kind of my way to kick off my weekends, decompress, relax. And anyway, long story short, I've been living out here for 18 years now, and it became evident to me probably 2 or 3 years in that my 10-acre property here does not produce enough firewood to, let's say, I'm going to get a little weird and survivally here, but if I had to make a fire to cook dinner every night, my property doesn't produce enough firewood to do that. I don't know how much land you would need to be able to do that, but this solves that problem, right? Because my property, my 10 acres definitely makes enough twigs where I could cook every day over a fire if I had to in an emergency. So, homestead use, cooking on the homestead in an event where you're off-grid. That's a great use for this stove. Now, base is still cool. The base on this stove is going to superheat. But this is one stove right here where you can see there's a divot. I burned this log with this stove. This stove will definitely superheat underneath of it, and this aluminum sheet is mandatory for this type of a stove. You got to have something that, like if you were using this anywhere where you don't want to damage a wood surface or whatever's underneath it, you got to put something down for this stove. That's just the way it's made. The gasification process on it works, and that's kind of what turned me on to wood gasifier stoves. So what does that mean, the gasification process? So with a wood gasifier stove, how they work, and I'm not a scientist, I play one on YouTube, but how they work is you have your primary fire going on in your burn chamber, and then somehow this stove has like a chimney effect. It creates a draft where air is pulled in through these bottom vents. It goes through a sleeve between the main burn chamber and the outer wall that superheats that air that's being pulled in, and then that air gets drafted out the top, and that superheated oxygen coming out the top mixes with any smoke, embers, unburnt particles that are coming off your primary fire in the burn chamber, and it ignites those. So the benefits of this stove is that once it gets going, like it is right now, you can see that there's going to be zero smoke or embers coming off the top of this stove. So that is that's important to me under certain circumstances. Now, if I'm cooking outside, I could care less for the most part, unless I'm in a high fire hazard area. Embers coming off the top don't matter, and I'm not terribly worried about the smoke. But if you're trying to be stealthy, this is a good option. But for me personally, in my quest for a backpacking stove, I was looking for something that I'm going to be hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I was looking for something that I would be able to use inside the trail shelters, even in, like especially in inclement weather, or whenever, something I would be able to use inside the trail shelters. So that's what started me down the path for these gasifier stoves. So the fact that once I get this thing going, it doesn't emit any smoke means that I could burn that inside a shelter almost like a fireplace, really. And so that's what started me testing these things out, and it works. Now this stove right here, even though it works, I'll say this, it's a little finicky. So like right now the gasification process is going. You can see it's emitting kind of like almost like your range at home where you get the burner effect, where you have all these little fingers of flame coming out and meeting in the middle. When the gasification process is going on the stove, works as advertised, no smoke, no embers, perfect. Where this stove struggles is when your ember bed dies down in there, and then you got to start feeding new twigs in there, start the gasification process again, it'll smoke. Creates a lot of smoke. But in the interim, right, this thing burns long enough that you could boil your 2 quarts of water or whatever you had to do with no smoke. And another plus to this thing is that the burn chamber on it is so large that you could fit a lot of wood in this thing, so it will burn for a long time between feedings. And it has this large open area right here to feed twigs into when your pot is on top of it. Very easy to feed. What else? So this stove has a lot going for it. You can see, I mean, nice tall flame coming off the top with that gasification process. Talking about a flame that's over 1 foot tall. This thing has a really fast boil time. And it will retain the embers in that chamber. It'll get like a bed of coals going in that chamber that lasts for quite a while. So this is, even after your flame will die down, this thing will continue to be a heat source for, you know, like 45 minutes after the fire dies out, still producing heat. And then when it finishes its process, there's very little waste residue left over. So you can see already it's kind of dying down a little bit. It's finishing up its gasification process. And then I'm just going to be left with those embers down on the bottom, and they'll continue to burn for, I don't know, however long they last, but it's nice. So, it is not compact. It does not pack down too small. It's heavy. Definitely wouldn't recommend it as a backpacking stove, but it has a lot of upside, a lot of positive features that, you know, for a homestead stove or a car camping stove, you might want to look at something like this for that. So that's the gasification Twig stove. All right, now we're getting into the Bush Buddy. So this is my ever new titanium 1000 milliliter pasta pot, which is what I carry my Bush Buddy inside of. And I got to do that because the Bush Buddy, right into the features, the Bush Buddy's a little bit thinner gauge steel than my other stoves. So I got to protect it. That's why it's inside the pasta pot. I keep it inside of this bandana just so that when I'm hiking, I'm not listening to that all day. I don't have to listen to it rattling around all day. The bandana stops the noise. So, Bush Buddy comes out. Set up Bush Buddy. Done. That's it. So, sets up that quick. Now, the difference between the Bush Buddy, this is also a wood gasifier stove, and the Chinese wood gasifier stove is that this weighs 6.2 ounces and it has a solid bottom, and the ash pan is built into it, but it's elevated off the solid bottom, so the bottom of this stove does not heat up enough. It doesn't matter how long you use it, what you burn inside of it, does not heat up enough to burn a wooden surface that you put it on. So, very appealing to me. And if you look at the inside of it, the burn chamber, for reference, there's my finger, not very deep. Because generally with gasification stoves, you do not want to stack the wood over the top of these vents. These holes in the top, that's where your hot superheated oxygen comes out of from the bottom. It comes out of there, and you don't want to stack the wood over the top of that because you'll obstruct the gasification process. So not a very deep burn chamber at all. So this does not hold as much wood, but you know what? Don't let that fool you, because I was kind of like a little turned off when I first got it, but after using it for a while, I could tell you that I don't know what those guys up there in Alaska where they build this thing are doing, but whoever designed this thing knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing because the design of this thing is perfected. And it shows when you use it. You appreciate how well this stove works. And listen, I have no vested interest in Bush Buddy or any of these stoves, but I'm telling you that this is a well thought out design and it functions extremely well. So let me load it up and we'll get it going. All right, let's light up the Bush Buddy. So I read the information that came with it, and they do not recommend a top-down lighting burn for the Bush Buddy, the company that makes them. So generally, I still like to put just a small layer of twigs in the bottom of it. So I guess I'm doing kind of like a modified top-down burn, but that's the way I've had the best luck starting this stove. So I'll get it going with some smaller twigs at first. As such. But generally a pretty easy stove to light. And then with any of these gasification stoves, you know, they suggest you put the lid on as soon as you can, because that kind of helps create the flue effect. The lid also on them has a kind of like a little bit of an enclosed dome, so that directs some of the heat back down into the stove. So it just helps things progress along faster if you put the lid on there. But anyway, so the Bush Buddy stove. Trying to gather my thoughts on this thing. So what I like about this stove, and you can see it's already into its gasification process. Bam, that quick. Operating as it's designed. It has a lot of the same features as the Chinese stove. It's easy to feed. This stove is very light and compact. Fits inside my pot. My intended use for the Bush Buddy from the onset, I was searching for a twig stove that I could take on the Appalachian Trail and burn inside the shelters. So the shelters there, they're three-sided shelters. One side is generally open to the weather, or they'll have a tarp in front of the fourth wall in the wintertime, and a small portion of that will be open. So they're well ventilated. There's not a carbon monoxide danger. So you can, well, I don't know. I mean, I've never heard anybody talk about burning a twig stove inside a shelter. So I might be outside of the box with my thinking a little bit. But anyway, that's the intended role for the stove. So the base of this stove, I mean, until it gets fully raging, is going to be manipulated. You can hold it. And even after it gets fully raging, you know, cooking hot, you could still use a bandana to pick it up and move it around if you had to. So if I'm in the shelter and I'm using my stove to cook dinner or something, and somebody shows up and they don't want it in there, I can pick it up and move it outside of the shelter. I can't do that with that other gasification stove. Once my gasification process starts, it works incredibly well as a gasifier. You can see in there that it's trying to smoke. That wood I put in there, these pinky-sized pieces, are wet. They're producing a lot of moisture vapor and smoke, and it's trying to smoke. This is something right here that would absolutely be smoking out of that Chinese stove. But the Bush Buddy handles that smoke 2 to 3 times better than that Chinese stove. It's the design of it, the way that it chimneys, and you could tell it's just incredibly efficient as a gasification stove. And this stove is designed to take larger pieces of wood. If I fill up that Chinese gas stove with thumb-sized wood, it chokes it out almost every time. It'll burn, but I get just a big smoky mess. This stove is designed to handle the larger pieces of wood, and you can see I could throw it in there, and I'm just not going to get. It's not going to choke the stove out. I'm not going to get a bunch of smoke. So as a result of that, it actually has a better gasification runtime. Once you get it going, I could feed almost anything in there and not smoke out a shelter. That's really the beauty of it, and no embers. So this thing works perfectly as designed. If you're looking for a wood gasifier stove that does what it's supposed to do, this is it. I'm very impressed with this stove. And then what's also impressive about it is, even though it has a small burn chamber, because you're able to feed those larger pieces of wood in there, it will run an incredibly long time. And then when it burns down, I could take, thumb-sized or larger pieces of wood, throw them in there, relight it, not smoke out the shelter, and it'll keep going. And I'm talking about 45 minutes, an hour per feeding, where this stove is still emitting heat. So I would be able to take a clothesline or something, a piece of string, and hang my socks over the top of the stove, dry them out, actually heat the whole shelter with the thing. Not, like if it's 20 degrees out, maybe it'll be 23 degrees inside the shelter, or 30 degrees or something, but every little bit helps. And you'd be able to warm your hands over it, cook a meal over it, make a hot water bottle for your sleeping bag, whatever. But I can't speak highly enough of the execution and design on this stove. They really worked at it and tweaked it to where it just it runs beautifully. So no smoke, no embers off the stove once you get it going. It doesn't scorch the ground where you put it, so I could put this on a wooden deck or a picnic table or whatever, cook my meal over it. Very solid, easy to feed, long run time, very efficient, so it uses very little fuel, and I don't know, it's a winner. It's just a fantastic stove. I'm super glad I got it, and it's going to come with me on my Appalachian Trail hike. At this point, I'm almost positive I'm going to bring it with me. Listen, 6.2 ounces. That's that's a significant amount of weight for a lightweight backpacker like me to bring, but I spent a lot of money to buy high-dollar, ultra-light backpacking gear so that I could cut the weight of my pack down. And I'm bringing next to nothing, really. I don't even have like a change of clothes other than what I'm going to be sleeping in at night. So I pared back the contents of my pack to the minimum, physically trained for it. So I feel like I've done the most I can to lighten my pack weight, and everything that's in my pack right now is basically a tool to help me accomplish my goal of completing a thru hike. There's really nothing of me in that pack, and that's what this is. This is coming, and I guess my Swiss Army knife, this is not the one I'm bringing, but the Swiss Army knife Huntsman. Those are the two items that are actually like essence of will items. So that's a piece of me. That's something that I want to bring on the trail because I enjoy it, and it's going to make my time out there fun, and really captures who I am. So hey, listen, if it doesn't work out the way I think it's going to work out, I just ship it home, right? Ship the stove home, and I gave it a good try. But to me, there's a lot of benefits to bringing it. Like I said, you're hiking all day and it's raining out, you get to that shelter. If I get a fire going on this thing, I could dry gear out. That's huge. I can warm up on a freezing cold night, where it's down in the single digits. Having a little warmth, a heat source inside of that shelter, to me, that's a gigantic morale boost. Now you can see, even after the fire goes out, especially like when you get those larger chunks of wood in there, you get a bed of coals. And that bed of coals, just like the Chinese gasifier stove, will burn wicked hot for quite a long time and put out a bunch of heat. And then if I want to get the stove started again to add some more fuel to it, it's really simple. You just throw a couple of twigs in there, blow on it. I guess you don't even have to blow on it, but whammo, she's going. And my gasification process started up again almost immediately. Very little or no smoke. So anyway, that's the Bush Buddy. After it burns down, you just end up just like most of these twig stoves. You end up with just a little powdery ash on the bottom, hardly any waste at all. This one here, you could actually pick it up and bring it outside and dump that ash out while the ash is still red hot, because of the way it's constructed. So that's that. Let me do my wrap up. I almost forgot to mention the ash pan that's built into the bottom of the Bush Buddy will hold enough ashes so that, in my experience, you could run this stove for hours before that ash pan will fill up to the point where you start having problems where it's clogging up the air intake. Hours and hours. And also, the companion stove by Zelf is designed for the Bush Buddy. So this stove, I should have showed it before I lit it on fire, but this stove actually fits perfectly inside the Bush Buddy, and it's got the correct spacing to where you get an ideal cook time. So this combined with the Twig stove gives you a pretty good hiking option. I haven't solidified which stove I'm actually going to bring. I'm kind of vacillating right now between a canister stove and this one. We'll see. But the canister stoves, I'm starting my through hike in January, so they have trouble in below freezing weather. There is some workarounds for that. So that's the issue with the canister stoves. And obviously the alcohol stoves, if it's going to be out for 5 days straight, you're talking about in the winter, where it takes more alcohol to get water boiling. I would have to bring, like 18 ounces of alcohol. So you start getting into a weight issue, and then you got to miser the amount of alcohol that you use. So that's a separate issue. Anyway, this is a stove video, so I'm derailing a little bit. Let me wrap it up now. Okay, the wrap up. So we'll go over each stove real quick. Firebox Nano titanium. Main function of this stove really excels at lightweight backpacking. Bush Buddy excels at stealth camping or a situation where you would want to use a stove in a quasi-enclosed area. Emberlit, or Rover Camo in this case. I would say fantastic get-home bag stove. Also could be used for backpacking, just like the Bush Buddy, and you know, extremely compact, pretty lightweight. Will run for a long time because you can fit bigger fuel in there. And then last but not least, the Chinese gasifier stove, car camping or homestead use. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And that's Will's stove video. You guys have a great one.